Good day, everyone. In this lecture, we will discuss the calculation of escalation at practical completion, and that will be for task 1. And once we've done that, we will continue with the calculation of the final escalation based on the final account. I'm not going to spend much time on the task 1 because that is a repetition of the previous discussion session we had based on escalation. If we look at the task 1, which is the escalation at practical completion, that is certificate number 10 in this case. Let us look at the general information given. In this case, what is important is that the contractor is late on this project. He asked for extension of time. He claimed 35 days and only 26 days was given. So he's 9 days late. So therefore, he's going to pay a penalty based on the contract agreement, but also there's some kind of a penalty, if I may call it that way, on the escalation as well. And we'll see that when we're going to calculate the final escalation in task 2, that we almost going to penalize the contractor for escalation calculation. We're not going to give him full escalation. So what is important, the contractor is late. So if we just quickly run through certificate number 10, all the values in this case is given. You've got certificate 10 at practical completion. In other words, we've reached that point where the contractor can hand over the building to the employer. The employer can move in and use the building for the purpose intended to. Certificate 9, the figures is given. That's the pre-penultimate certificate. And then the contractor moves on site. Once he's paid for certificate 9, he moves off site, and then we've got 90 days to complete and sign off the final account. And the final account values for each work group is also given at this stage. Obviously, I've mentioned before that we will, when we're going to do the certificates, payment certificate calculations, we will determine those values. And also when we get to the final account stage, we will determine the values for each and every work group. So just to quickly run through the certificate number 10. That is now at practical completion. You've got all the values for the work group, less the previous certificate 9, and that will give you the V value, which is now subject to escalation. What is also important is that certificate 10 in this case is dated the 26th of June, so that will determine the IE indice that we're going to use. The IO indice is based on the tender date, the base month, which is in this case, August 2017. So you can just check the indices. You apply the formula in this case, in other words, the Hewlett formula, the 0.85 times V, IE divided by IO less 1. That is still applicable up to and including practical completion. So we've reached practical completion with certificate number 10. So you apply the Hewlett formula for up till certificate 10 in this case, just check the values. You add the previous escalation that comes from the accumulative total from certificate 9 that is given. So the total up to and including certificate 10 in this case for escalation for the main contractor was 44,033 Rand and odd cents. As well as for the nominated subcontractor in this case, only one, the electrical installation at practical completion, 4,324 Rand. Obviously, you've added the previous accumulative total for escalation on the electrical. For certificate 9 up to certificate 9 was 4,000 Rand. So this is basically the task 1, the calculation of escalation on practical completion. Right, so that was certificate 10. Now task 2 asks us to calculate the final escalation. So let's just spend some time on that one. In other words, that will be certificate number 11 based on the final account. In our case, for this course, we will issue a payment certificate at practical completion, and then thereafter only one certificate at the final account stage. In practice, you might have interim certificates during this 90-day period as well, depending if the contractor is in a cash flow predicament. He might ask for some additional payments. And as a quantity surveyor, I know there is still an amount due to the contractor. I'll just make 100% sure, and I will issue a payment certificate, an interim payment certificate during the 90 days. Right, for our purposes, as I said, for this module, we will only issue a payment certificate at practical completion and then only at final account stage. So in this case, we've now compiled the final account. The contractor is happy with the final account. We can sign off the final account, but we still need to determine the escalation on the outstanding amount due to the contractor. And in this case, just bear in mind, he's late, so we'll apply that penalty factor. Good. So the formula that we're going to use for the final escalation is the AF divided by VF times V. So if we just go down to the formula, AF divided by VF. Now, what is AF? That's a theoretical amount. In other words, we took the value of each work group and we escalated from day one right up till practical completion. We all know that is not the case because you do the earthworks in the first month and then you're finished. Then you continue with the next trade, which might be concrete. But we take each and every work group, we'll take the value for the work group and we escalate it from day one right up till practical completion for all the work groups, and that will give you a theoretical amount. It is not escalation. The VF is the amount that was subject to escalation at practical completion. And the V value is the outstanding amount at final account stage. And if the contractor is late, and in this case he is, so therefore we can apply the 0.55 factor. So the formula is AF divided by VF times V times it by the late completion factor of 0.55. So let's first look at the calculation of the AF value. And that's a straightforward calculation. I've said you in the previous discussion, you will take your practical completion certificate and you're going to reproduce it. The only difference is that the previous total is 0. So if we go back to certificate number 10, which was your certificate at practical completion, you're going to reproduce this certificate, except the previous totals will all be 0. Right? All be 0. You apply the same indices that you've used for certificate number 10 at practical completion. Apply the Haylett formula, and therefore you get a value that's almost an enormous figure. As I said, this is not escalation. It is a theoretical amount because you've taken the amount, let's say for earthworks, and you escalate it from day one base month right up to practical completion to get that total figure. Right, so the AF value in a nutshell is you take the practical completion certificate, you reproduce it. The only difference is that the previous totals is 0 and you don't add previous escalation because this is not escalation. It is just to calculate the theoretical amount for the at practical completion. So that gives me the AF value. You're also going to do the same for the nominated subcontractor in this case, which is the electrical installation at practical completion. That was the value. Apply the indices to get the AF value for the electrical installation. Obviously, if there was, let's say, air conditioning, you will have a separate calculation for electrical, the air conditioning installation. So for all nominated subcontractors, you will have separate calculations. Good, so that is to calculate the AF value. Now let's look at the final escalation. So obviously you've done the final account, and we've got the figures from the final account. There's your values from the final account. Let's say for work group 104, there's the amount, and there's the amount for the final escalation. Less the previous, that is now the value from certificate 10, because we are now preparing certificate 11, the final escalation. And note there's no indices applicable at final escalation. You use the formula. So firstly, let's calculate what is due to the contractor that is subject to escalation. So it's the final account values, and there's a whole process that we're going to learn at the later stage how to determine the specific values. It is a lengthy exercise based on the final account. So that figures is given, that's your final account figures, less the previous totals, which is in this case from your practical completion certificate, and that will give me the difference. Now note what is important here, and this is a good quantity surveyor because you've got no negative figures. And remember, if there was negative figures applicable in this column, it means that you've over-certified. All right, make sure, and that is important at practical completion, that you are 100% sure about the values. You don't want to come with surprises at the end of the day and have negative figures, which means you've over-certified, and there's a possibility that the contractor must refund the employer, which is not good. All right, so you've got your final account, less the practical completion values, and that will give you the value that is still due to the contractor. Now, we all also learned that non-adjustable items, that's your profit and attendance and any form of day works. If we look at the given information, that is referred to as work group 0, because we say for profit and attendance and day works, there's no escalation. So there's no work group for that specific item, or the day works item, or profit and attendance, non-adjustable. All right. So we've determined the AF. Let's look at the VF. And I've said the VF in this case is the amount subject to escalation at practical completion. So in this case, if we look at certificate number 10, which was done at practical completion, your VF value was the 1.2 million, which was subject to escalation. The contractor will receive 1.227 million, but only 1.2 million was subject to escalation, and that is the VF value. The V value, which is now the outstanding amount due to the contractor subject to escalation, is the 52,441. Obviously, the contractor will receive 52,864, but only from that amount, only 52,441 is subject to escalation. So we've determined the AF value previously, the AF value for the main contractor and as well as for the nominated subcontractor. In this case, we've determined the outstanding amount due to the contractor, the V value. So AF divided by VF, times it by V, apply the 0.55 factor because the contractor is late, and that should give you an amount of 682 Rand and 98 cents. Escalation still due to the contractor. We've already certified up till certificate number 10, the amount of 44,033 Rand. Now, if we go to certificate number 10, there's your 44,000 odd Rand. That's the total, the same for your electrical. Just bear in mind that figure, we will discuss that. So we add the previous escalation up to and including certificate 10. So the contractor on this project, the final escalation on the project for the main contractor is 44,716 Rand. Again, on the nominated subcontract side, this figure is supplied by the electrical engineer. And remember, all these figures are excluding VAT. So that as a quantity surveyor, I will ask the electrical engineer, what is the value for the final value for electrical installation? Because the engineer is also preparing a final account for his work. So he will submit that and provide you with a final account figure. You've already certified 49,000 Rand, which is the VF in this case, subject to escalation. So the outstanding amount due to the nominated subcontractor is 1949 cents, which is the V value, subject to escalation. If we apply the formula is still applicable. AF divided by VF times it by V times by 0.455. You've got the values, and that gives you 42 Rand. In other words, on this 1,949, the contractor, nominated contractor, will receive escalation of 42 Rand. We've already certified up till certificate 10, 4,324 Rand. So that gives me then the final value for escalation on the electrical installation of 4,367 Rand. Good. There's just a note that we could also expect non-adjustables on the electrical installation in this case. So for the nominated subcontractors, there could be non-adjustables as well. In other words, there could be contract instructions where the nominated subcontractor decided, well, I'm going to price that at current rate, so therefore I don't need any escalation on that. So then we add it to non-adjustables for the electrical installation. You'll see in further calculations when we will have exercises and then we'll add it under non-adjustables. Good. As I said before, we've treated this as an individual task as such, but escalation form part and parcel of a payment certificate. So when we're going to issue a payment certificate at the end of the month and the contract is subject to escalation, we need to calculate the escalation on that project. Good. I hope that you've learned quite a bit today. And if there's any questions, you're most welcome to contact me. Until next time, keep safe and we'll meet again.